Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry for the screaming. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the latest installment of the Budapest Lecture Series. Our guest today has come really far from home, to be precise from South Africa, to get here to Hungary, so we truly appreciate your efforts of coming here. And it's Ernst Roots. I'm always butchering Dutch names, but I think I've had harder ones before, from Indonesia. But Ernst is a political activist, writer and filmmaker from South Africa. And it's also an amazing title. He's the Chief Executive for Strategy and International Liaison of AfriForum, a South African civil rights organization. He's an attorney, and he's holding, now not a master's degree, but a doctorate degree in legal philosophy from the University of Pretoria. He's also known for his work in the film industry, has produced several films and documentaries about a history of land ownership and the impact of land reform policies in South Africa. First and foremost, give a warm round of applause for him coming from South Africa, please, because that's already a feat on its own. And before this lecture started, he told me that he actually read a Hungarian book, namely also a very significant book. It's Egri Csillagok in Hungarian. In English, I just learned it. It's The Eclipse of the Crescent Moon. And I just wanted to touch upon how on earth did you read this book? Why?
Well, firstly, thank you very much for hosting me. I've been to MCC before, and I've been a big fan of MCC and for the last 2 years, and I've met some people who are involved with MCC, so it really is, I'm not just saying this, it really is a privilege for me to be here. Yeah, and I think maybe I can start by reporting back that I have fulfilled my promise to a representative of the MCC. Last year, a colleague and I was at the National Conservatism Conference in Miami, Florida, and there was an MCC booth. And I recognized it because I've been here to MCC before. I've met with, as I said, some of your directors. And I went to the booth and I introduced myself and I said to them, I'm a big fan of Hungary. I've been here a few times. And there were some books on the table and I was really interested in the books and I asked if I could buy one. And the lady said to me, I don't know if she's here, but she said to me that the books are still coming, so I can't buy one yet. And she then said to me, but she'll make me a deal. She will give me one if I promise to read it. And I said to her, no, I promised to read it, and there were several books on the table, and then I asked her, which one do you recommend, which one is best to understand Hungarian history and Hungarian culture, and she recommended Giza Gardoni's book, and that was last year, September, and now I'm at MCC, and so I can report back and say that I have read the book, and I thought it was really fantastic.
And just to touch upon one aspect of the book, of course, you read the story. Of course, we Hungarians know the story, but that is one significant point in Hungarian history where the people defending the castle of Eger managed to stand their ground against the Turks coming in, a foreign force, so to speak. You're, of course, part of the Afrikaners community in South Africa, of course, a minority group within South Africa. Can you draw any parallels from that book story and your community story?
Yes, so there are several parts of that story that really stood out to me. One of my favorite sections is right at the beginning. Those of you who've read the book would know that it's the story of Gergely Boromisa when he was still small. He was kidnapped, and then him and his friend at the time, who would later be his wife, they escaped, and they were small. They were, I can't remember, 8 years or 10 years old or something. And then they stole a horse, and they traveled back to their village. It was one of the Turkish horses they stole. And then there's a section in the book where it says that they rode through the night, and it was very dark, and the trees were big and gloomy. But Gergely was not afraid because they were Hungarian trees. And it's such a beautiful way of saying, of explaining the whole underlying point about being attached to your culture and being attached to your community and your country and your land, so to speak. But in terms of the story, what really struck me about the Battle of Eger is the parallels with Afrikaner history, which I wouldn't blame you for not knowing it that well, but we had, for example, the Battle of Blood River, which was a battle in 1838, where there were about 300 voortrekkers, or the Boers as we are known also, and we found ourselves surrounded by 12,000 Zulu warriors who attacked this lager. And my great-great-great-great-grandfather was a man named Sarel Salia. He was in that lager. And I'm very proud of him and also my family history, because they then got together and they said, well, we have a very big problem. We are 300 and we are surrounded by 12,000. So we have to do something. And then Sarel Salia suggested, or he had a conversation with the leader of the track, and they decided that they're going to write a vow to God. And the vow is to say that if God protects us on the day of the battle, and if we survive, or if we are victorious, we will commemorate this day in the future, in future generations as well. Regardless of what day it is, we will commemorate it as a Sunday, and we will build a church to honor God. And eventually the battle took place, and at the end of the battle, 3,000 Zulu warriors were killed, and not one of the Boers were killed. There were one or two who were injured. So up to today, still, on the 16th of December every year, we celebrate that day as the day of the vow, which is like a Sunday. It doesn't matter what day of the week it is, we go to church on that day. And the story of Egge reminded me also the incredible odds against the Hungarians, reminded me of the Battle of Blood River. And we also had the Battle of Vegkop, which is a battle we had to fight almost in similar, it was, I think, about against 3,000 Matabeles, as we described them. But our ancestors were ambushed. We didn't know that the attack would happen. And there were women and children in the lager as well. And so the women and children had to fight together with the Boers. And this is also what happened at Egge, where the Hungarian women came out and also helped with the battle. So in a strange way, not being Hungarian, reading that book made me very proud. It made me proud of Hungarian history, even though I'm not Hungarian, but it also made me proud of my own history, because I could see the parallels and I could imagine my own ancestors being at that battle. So, and it also it opens up an important or a very interesting topic about the parallels, and it's something that hasn't been said about this, but the parallels between the Afrikaners or the Boers and the Hungarians, and I've discovered that there are quite a lot of parallels, of which I'm very glad.
If there is one more battle that you remember that happened before the siege of Eger, that was Nándorfehérvár. I will help you later with the pronunciation. But the reason behind that is that we have our noon bell sounds, and that is also part of a tradition that it goes for the heroes. And it's very interesting that you pointed out the role of culture, our history, and traditions. And I want to touch on a quote that you mentioned when you were at the Conservative Political Action Conference here in Hungary last year. And what you said was, tradition is a set of solutions for which we have forgotten the problems. What were you meaning when you were saying these lines?
Well, if I had 10 seconds more in that speech, I would have given the source. It's actually a quote by Donald Kingsbury. And it's so striking to say tradition is a set of solutions to which we have forgotten the problems. It is to say that tradition could be described differently as the wisdom of the many. I believe it was Edmund Burke who said that. It is a way of thinking and a way of doing things that was developed over generations and centuries by our ancestors, by our communities. And they have developed this way of doing things because of the circumstances under which they lived, because of the problems they experienced, because of the challenges they had to overcome. And as a result of that, tradition develops and grows. And so we see that in the world today especially, is this assault on tradition and on Western tradition in particular. And in as far as this assault succeeds, we find that all these new problems pop up. And then the answer, now the question is, how do we deal with these new problems that we're experiencing now that we didn't experience maybe a few generations or decades earlier? And part of the answer is that these problems, or part of the explanation is we're experiencing these problems now because of the assault on our tradition. And our tradition actually provided solutions to these problems to which we have forgotten the answers. And so if we want to solve many of the new problems we're experiencing now and the friction in the world and the uncertainty, to many of these problems our ancestors have already developed solutions. And the answer is sometimes easier than we think, and it's to return to our healthy Western tradition.
Touching upon the idea of forgotten problems, I think, and I speak on my behalf, maybe people in the audience are much more knowledgeable on South African history. I just had one lecture to moderate on that, so my knowledge is far from being extensive on this subject. But after 1990s and Nelson Mandela, I think the Western media attention towards South Africa diminished, or almost ceased to exist. And we almost had this Fukuyaman end of history state where democracy prevailed. After 1990, communism failed, so South Africa will also go on the stage of development. Is it the case? And with your organization, how do you reflect on this situation?
Yes. So Professor Koos Malan is a constitutional expert in South Africa. He wrote a very important article in January. It's published on Politics Web in South Africa, politicsweb.co.za. And he said that he said South Africa is going through a constitutional rearrangement. And he said South Africa is becoming important again to the world. Because there were several times in our history when the world spoke about South Africa. And the prediction is it's going to happen soon again. And one was during the 17th century, when South Africa became a refreshment station for ships traveling across Africa to trade with the East, with Indonesia and India and so forth. And so this refreshment station was very important. And then another important part, perhaps one of the best known parts of our history, was the Anglo-Boer War, which was very significant because it was one of the first highly publicized wars in history due to new technology, cameras and video cameras, and it was 1899 to 1902. And I recently read a fascinating book about the First World War, and there's quite a section in there about how the Anglo-Boer War led or was one of the factors that you have to understand the First World War. And to simplify or summarize, one reason for this is the massive sympathy that Europe had with the Boers as opposed to with the English that attacked South Africa. And the other is the fact that the war was stretched out so long, and the English thought, we have a joke in South Africa among the Afrikaners where the English said initially the war will be over before Christmas. And then we said, yes, but they did not say which Christmas. So the war was stretched out for 3 years, and it really it conveyed a message to Europe that England is not as strong as it wants us to believe. And so that was an important part when the whole world, or at least much of the world, spoke about South Africa. Then, of course, the other, probably most important part is the apartheid system. A lot of people know only one thing about South Africa, or two things, is that there was the apartheid system and Nelson Mandela. And then that culminated in the early 90s after the fall of the Berlin Wall with this end of history ideology, you might say, the belief that the whole world's going to become liberal democracies and communism or socialism has been defeated. And now South Africa has been presented to the world as a miracle because there was a peaceful transition and as the country with the best constitution in the world. So it was presented as this massive, incredible miracle story. I think it's a BBC documentary about South Africa, and it's called Miracle Rising. And so once this miracle happened, everyone lost interest, and no one no one looked back to say, oh, well, is this miracle actually as wonderful as we thought it was? And the answer is it isn't. The answer is South Africa is failing spectacularly on almost every conceivable measure. And we can talk about that if you want. Just to give you one example, we have this new thing, we've had it for a few years now, load shedding, which is that our electricity supplier, for example, is government controlled. They're not able to provide electricity. So just the other day, we had a day in South Africa where we went through 11 hours without electricity. So the country is collapsing. That's what's happening. But what's also significant is that it's not the entire country that is collapsing. So we have massive unemployment, massive crime rates. I saw the murder ratio in Hungary is, I believe, 0.8 per 100,000 murders. So for every 100,000 people in Hungary, 0.8 are murdered each year. In South Africa, it's 34, and it's increasing. But what's actually happening, you can look at let's put it this way, it's like, that's the problem with averages. You can ask the question, what's the average salary in New York? And you would find it's, I think, $70,000 or $50,000. But that includes the homeless person in Harlem, but it also includes the billionaire on Wall Street. And that's the thing with South Africa, is while the country is failing, there are some communities who are flourishing, despite the fact that the country is failing. And so we are naturally leading to a constitutional rearrangement. And I can't tell you what it's going to look like, but I'm convinced that it's going to happen, because it's absolutely not sustainable what's happening in South Africa. And I think the important lesson to be learned from this is that the ideology and the ideology that underpinned this belief that South Africa is a miracle story turned out to be wrong, because it didn't work out the way the world, and the Western world in particular, expected it would turn out.
You mentioned this constitutional rearrangement element to it, but now, of course, we can hear about land expropriation from the wine population, but from not digging deep into the legal side, but what were the steps from 1990 to 2023 towards land usage and just desegregation, not for the white.
So yes, so what happened is very interesting, or ironic, you might say. A very important difference between Hungary, or you could say Europe, and South Africa is the consequences of the fall of the Berlin Wall, or the fall of the Iron Curtain. So generally, and that was the end of history theory, is that the wall has fallen, the Iron Curtain has fallen, communism has been discredited, and so it was interpreted as the end of communism or socialism, or if not the end, at least it would not be as significant as it was during the Cold War. What happened in South Africa was the opposite. The fall of the Berlin Wall signaled the advent of communism or socialism in South Africa. And there's a very good explanation for that, is South Africa had, under the white minority government, there was a legislation called the Suppression of Communism Act. So communism was illegal in South Africa. And Afrikaners knew that the system, the political system, the apartheid system, was unsustainable. There was virtually no one in South Africa left, or very few people who believed the system had to carry on. And the metaphor that people used at the time was, it's like riding on a tiger, riding on the back of a tiger. You know you have to get off the tiger, but you also know if you get off the tiger, it's going to eat you. And so there was this concern, how do we have to end this system, the apartheid system, but how do we end it without being eaten? And then when the Berlin Wall fell, former President F.W. de Klerk in South Africa and the National Party government at the time said, well, this signals the end of communism or socialism. Communism has been discredited. If it's not necessarily defeated, now is the perfect time to negotiate with these communist-aligned movements in South Africa. And the joke we tell now is these communist-aligned movements, of which the ANC was the biggest, and the ANC is now the ruling party in South Africa, they had the opposite interpretation. They said, the government and the ruling party thinks communism has been discredited, so now is the perfect time to negotiate with him. And so they had this plan, and they wrote it down actually in their policy documents. They called it the National Democratic Revolution. And what that means essentially is to hide your communism or your socialism, or to present it under the banner of liberalism. To say, listen, we really want liberalism. We want liberal democracy. And we want a Bill of Rights with individual rights. And then to say, once we get that, that would be phase one of the revolution. So that would be the word they used is, it would be a beachhead. Like think about D-Day, the beachhead you get. And once you get that beachhead, you can move to the second phase of the revolution. So the strategy was among these organizations, to present themselves as liberal Democrats, and to get global support, which they had, and then to get power. And once they control the government, they can start implementing socialist policies, which is exactly what's happening in South Africa. So we have this process of land reform. There's a process now or an attempt to change the South African constitution, the property rights clause, to empower the state to expropriate private property without compensation. And there are many, many other levels or spheres of government where we have these programs coming to the fore. And with that, not surprisingly, we also see the collapse of South Africa on, as I said, on virtually every identifiable level, whether we're talking about crime, the quality of education, equality, unemployment, service delivery, everything is collapsing. That's really where we are now. There's no debate more in South Africa about whether South Africa is succeeding. The only debate now is whether South Africa is a failed state or whether it's becoming a failed state. That's the debate. There's virtually no one left who thinks the country is a success.
And as this conversation is taking a darker and darker turn, this is the time for an advertisement break. So as you have the Slido right above our heads, if you have any questions to ask for the speaker or about South Africa, feel free to do so. But to turn towards a more positive note, or it depends whether if it is a positive note, you have the AfriForum movement. And I also talked to Paul Moritz during a lunch talks debate not so long ago, and he was talking about the Solidarity movement. You have AfriForum. What is it that your organizations are doing to end the racial division and injustice that is taking place in South Africa?
So there are, I think, if we were to talk about why South Africa is significant at the moment or becoming increasingly significant, I would say that there are two overarching reasons. The one is what I've mentioned, the failure of South Africa and the lessons we can learn from that the belief that it would work was based on false assumptions. And the other is the solutions that are coming to the fore. Now, we cannot solve all the problems in South Africa, but we do believe that we have discovered some solutions. And it's not utopian, it's very practical, ground-level solutions through experience. And it's in a way to return to tradition, you might say. So AfriForum is the organization that I represent, and we are part of this movement called the Solidarity Movement. And our goal, we're a community-based organization. Our vision, if you want to know what our agenda is, our overarching main goal is to ensure that our community, the Afrikaner community, has a future in the southern tip of Africa. Whether that southern tip of Africa is called South Africa or whether it's called something else is a different question. But we want to ensure that we have a future. And the way we do that is to return to learn, let's put it this way, we're at a think tank, so we can quote some people, to take some lessons from Alexis de Tocqueville and his observations in Democracy in America, for those of you who have read it. When he found that, or predicted that was America in the 1830s, he predicted that America was going to become a great nation. And one of the main reasons was that it has a very strong, the Americans have a very strong community focus with decentralized government, and they want to ensure prosperity through community-based institutions. Now, an institution, this is an institution. We're sitting at an institution. A school is an institution, a university, a church is an institution, a social club is an institution, a media organization is an institution, an NGO is an institution. And so if you really had to summarize our strategy, it is to ensure a future for our people through community institutions. And that's why we have this movement with more than 20 different institutions. AfriForum is one of them. We have educational institutions. We have our own media institutions. We've built up all these institutions. And they are quite successful, if I might add. So AfriForum, for example, is a pressure group. It's an NGO. Our funding comes from our members. It's community-based, as I said, so we don't get government support. We don't have companies that support us. The government doesn't agree with what we're doing. So the only funding we can get is from our members. And in a way, that is our strength. So to be a member of AfriForum you have to make a monthly contribution. So you have to pay, you can decide how much, but the average is about 80 or 100 rands a month, which is how much, $10. I'm not sure how many thousand foreign that would be. But we have now reached a point where we have 310,000 members. So we have 310,000 people who make a monthly contribution to our work. And that is how I'm able to be here to speak with you today. And we have built, through the Solidarity Movement, a technical college called Soltech, which cost over 300 million rands, to put it in our currency. And the single biggest contribution to that college was 10 rands. So even if you don't understand, if you don't know the exchange rate, the single biggest donation was 10 rand to build an educational institution that was eventually cost more than 300 million rand. And the way we were able to do that was to have hundreds of thousands of people who make monthly donations of 10 rand to say we need to build our own institutions. So that's, and there's a variety of levels on which we're doing that. I mean, I could talk about it for very long, but building your own institutions, and then just to get to your question, we are founded on this philosophy, you might say, that we call it, it's not our own word, others have used it as well, but to encourage mutual recognition and respect and peaceful coexistence. So we believe that people often say we are united in our diversity, and the question is, what does diversity really mean? If diversity means you have to abandon who you are, you have to destroy your own cultural identity or your natural identity and take up this new identity. So in the European context, you could say, does diversity mean that you cannot be Hungarian anymore? You have to be European. Then it's not, is that really diversity? And that's sort of the pressure in South Africa is, we cannot be, the pressure is that we are not Afrikaners anymore, we are South Africans. They are not Zulus anymore, they are South Africans. They are not Xhosas and Sutus and all these different communities. We are all South Africans, as if we all have the same culture, but we don't. And so the way forward is to recognize that we have different cultures, we have different traditions, we have different ways of thinking about things. We, for example, are Westerners, we think in terms of property rights and private ownership. The Zulu community thinks in terms of communal ownership. The king owns the land, the Zulu king. And we disagree with that, but it's their culture, it's their tradition. It's not our place to tell them they have to change their way of thinking. We agree with the fact that they should decide for themselves. And within that mutual recognition and respect, that's the only sustainable way to really combat racism and friction between groups. This attempt to build, they called it the South African experiment, and this is one of the reasons why South Africa failed. It was this attempt to convince everyone that actually we are the same, when actually we're not. And the fact that we have different views about the world is not necessarily a bad thing, it's just a fact of life. And instead of trying to suppress that, just recognize that and deal with it. So there was a saying in South Africa, a famous saying by Samora Machel from Mozambique actually. He said, for the nation to prosper, the tribe must die. So in the South African context, it implied for South Africa to succeed, the Afrikaners must die, or the Boers must die, and the Zulus must die, and so forth. And again, to put it in European terms, it's like saying for Europe to prosper, the Hungarians must die, and the French must die, and so forth. And it's very ideological, and it didn't work. It collapsed. And so I think we are discovering that now, and we are finding solutions to this problem.
Maybe to be more direct, does AfriForum cooperate in any shape or form with the Xhosas, Zulus, or the Parulongs, you name it, tribe?
Yes, so we have, it's one of our main priorities is mutual, as I said, mutual recognition and respect, but cooperation with different communities. And I can give you many examples. One is just from a legal perspective, the Nkungumati community in the KwaZulu-Natal province, for those of you who know South Africa. It's a Zulu community who are really poor. They are in a rural area. They don't have a lot of government support. And they, for example, were promised a school by the government, which they never got. The children in that village have to walk about 20 kilometers to school every day. They have to cross a river to get to school. And they were promised the school, which they never got. So we assisted them by with our legal team by actually taking the government to court to fulfill this promise. So that's one example, but we have many mutual cooperation agreements with traditional communities because we believe we have certain expertise that we can contribute without being paternalistic, without saying to them, we know the solution, you don't, you have to do things the way we think you ought to do it. It's about understanding each other's cultures and traditions and working together. So one of the things, we have very good farmers. The Boers, actually the word Boer means farmer in Afrikaans. So our nation is named after farming, after agriculture. And we have, well, some people say we have some of the best farmers in the world. So we have really good commercial farmers. And that's one way in which we can contribute to other communities through joint projects where we bring experts in from our community in this rural community and say, well, let's help you with agriculture. But we're doing it on a variety of levels. Another is this friction. Remember I said about this philosophy, for the nation to prosper, the tribe must die. So as a result of this philosophy also, what's happening in South Africa is traditional, if I can put it bluntly, traditional black communities in South Africa are not recognized by the South African government because those in power have an ideological project. And so traditional communities and traditional leaders don't get recognition. And so we believe this is a very important way of working together, also to get to your previous question of combating racism, to say that we think we agree with this community when they say to us that their leader is this person. They recognize the authority of this person, not some government official that was appointed, and they've been told that government representative is the person they have to obey. And so we've been through court cases and many other projects and pressure and so forth to get traditional leaders to get more recognition in South Africa, which is why we believe, especially in the South African context, decentralization and federalism, to use that word, is certainly a very important part of the solution.
I also wanted to touch upon a seemingly obvious parallel. Maybe it's not obvious, but in the book of Balázs Orbán, in the Hungarian Way of Strategy, he mentions that despite the fact that Hungary is a European nation that has adopted Western Christianity, based on our history, we have obviously inherited the spirit of the steppes, just some Eastern influence, you name it. But the Afrikaners are also in some shape or form similar shoes, because of course you have the Dutch legacy, but you've been in South Africa long enough to develop your African identity. In your everyday life or now, how does it manifest in your lives? Or can this be seen that you are, because the way I received this is I just saw a video interview and they just said, if the Afrikaners don't like being in South Africa, why don't they just come back to Europe? Well, it's not that simple, because that you are not just European, you also have something else now.
Yes, so that Orbán Balázs's book is also very useful, and that's one of the things I appreciate about, or we appreciate about Hungarian culture and the Hungarian way of thinking, because it seems that many in the West, if I can just use a segue to get to your answer, many people in the West, especially Western Europe, and especially North America, seem to struggle with this issue of the individual and the community. And there's this trend in the world today where the individual is presented as the beginning and the end of identity, and everything is about individual rights. And of course the individual is important, and individual rights are important. And it's something that Orbán Balázs also explains in his book, that there has to be a proper balance between the freedom of the individual and the freedom of the community. And we live in a world today where, if I might say, especially in the international conservative movement as well, people tend to think of freedom as only the individual must be free, as if the freedom of the community doesn't matter. And that's, I think, an important point that comes through. But to get to your question is, we, as the Afrikaners, we are called the Afrikaners, so we named ourselves after the continent. Our identity was shaped and created in Africa. And we are Westerners. We regard ourselves as part of the broader Western civilization. We read Plato and Aristotle and all of these. But we are also African in the sense that our identity was shaped in Africa. And so I've been to the Netherlands, and I didn't feel like I was going home when I got there. It is a foreign country to me. And so it's not quite that simple. The way, and I think a parallel between the Hungarians and the Afrikaners is the Hungarians, and you will obviously know this much better than I do, but it seems to me that the Hungarian identity was shaped very much by this balancing of the East and the West, or the fact that Hungary is sort of between the East and the West in a certain sense. And so there were some Eastern influences in Hungarian identity. And it's the same with us. So the Afrikaners, you might say, we are standing with our one leg in Western civilization and Western history, and our other in Africa. And so Africa is so much part of our identity that we would not survive as a community. We don't believe that we would if we were just to move to Europe or something like that, because we've been shaped by Africa, and we've been there for hundreds of years. We've been in Africa since before the USA became the USA, to put it that way. And so even though we are Westerners and we have ancestors in the Netherlands and Germany and France in particular, of course many other countries as well, but these three in particular, we don't regard ourselves as Dutch or French or Europeans, or Europeans in that sense of the word at least.
And now that we have established your unique identity, I also want to touch upon the identity of conservatism, because obviously that is an idea or a concept that many nations try to conceptualize in their own framework. So how does the Afrikaner or the South African conservatism look like?
Yes, so I want to say two things that might seem contradictory, so I have to explain it so it's not contradictory. We are conservatives, we are social conservatives, we are Christians, broadly speaking. Obviously not every single Afrikaner, but we're a Christian nation. We cherish family values, we cherish culture and cultural identity and so forth. But we don't think, and when I say we, I don't speak necessarily for the entire community, I at least speak for our organization and the movement of organizations of which I'm part. We believe that we must be careful of the word conservatism because of the ism at the end, which suggests that it's an ideology. And so actually in Afrikaans, if you translate conservatism to Afrikaans, you say conservatisme. But we don't, the isme at the end means it's an ideology, but we don't use conservatisme. We don't use that word. We would say die conservatiewe idee, or die conservative traditie, which is the conservative idea or the conservative tradition. So we believe that it's inherently wrong to try to replace a bad ideology with a good ideology, because an ideology, in essence, is a theory about how the world ought to be constructed. And therein lies the problem with ideology. So there are ideologies that are better than others. Liberalism is much better than communism. But the essence of it is a recognition of reality. It's a recognition of human nature. And that implies or also naturally leads us to conclude that people have different identities. There's a way of, it's probably controversial to say today, but in G.K. Chesterton's, I can't remember which book, might be Everlasting Man, he talks about, he was on a railway, on a train, and he said to him that across the aisle from him sat a Chinese person. And then he recognized, or he thought that he probably has more in common with Herodotus than with this person sitting across the train from him. Herodotus, of course, the ancient Greek historian. And what he meant by that is that he's a Westerner. And so there are many things that we have in common with Europeans and with the West that we don't have in common with African tribes, so to speak. But there are also some important things that we have in common with the Zulus and the Xhosas and these different communities in South Africa that we don't have in common with for example, with English-speaking white South Africans. And so so identity, just to pull it back, takes place on several levels. You as an individual have an identity, but then also a cultural community has an identity. You have a cultural identity, but then you also have a civilizational identity, if we can use Samuel Huntington's approach. So on a civilizational level, we are part of the Western civilization, but on a cultural level, we are our own cultural community with its own distinct features.
One question that I truly wanted to ask, and this is something that I think all of us try to find answers to. We are in a very politicized world, from the left, from the right. And the main question that each party would like to answer is, how do we solve injustice? How do we cure injustice?
Yeah.
And of course, conservatism is more dominant here in Hungary, and I would say even in the Afrikaners community. But do you think can the conservative idea, either the Hungarian or the South African or whichever you mean, can it solve the idea of injustice, be it social or racial? And if so, how?
Well, I would start by saying that we need to rehabilitate the word justice. There are these political, you might even say ideological buzzwords in the world today that are actually words or terminology with a very strong, very healthy Western traditional content. But these words have been stripped of their original meaning and are being presented as something else. And justice is one of these words. Another one is equality. The ancient Greeks and the Romans and obviously the Bible talks about equality, but when the Bible talks about, or at least when the message of equality you get from the Bible is completely different from the modern conception of equality. The biblical message is we are all equal before God, even though we have different talents and strengths and so forth. The modern conception is something else. Dignity is another one. Dignity used to mean that you are, the Afrikaans word is waardigheid, it's worthiness is our word for dignity, or I think it's the German word as well. So you have dignity if you act in a dignified manner. That's the traditional way of looking at it. The modern way is saying that you have dignity if other people treat you in a way that you would like to be treated. And it's the same with justice. The Western conception of justice is the main topic in Plato's Republic. And the Western conception of justice used to be justice prevails when there's harmony in a community, and you achieve harmony when each citizen or each individual, if you want to put it in modern terms, finds their place in the community. In other words, or if you want to put it in biblical terms, each individual uses their talents, their God-given talents to the best of their ability to contribute to the greater good. And if people find their unique place and they contribute to this greater good, that is when justice prevails. The modern conception of justice is that you have to punish people based on their identity for something that they didn't necessarily do, but someone who looks like them did something several hundred years ago. So if the question is, how do we find justice? The underlying question would have to be, what do we mean by justice? I think in terms of the modern idea, there's no quick fix. I can't find, we don't know of one. Something that we can do now and then we are all satisfied that justice has been achieved. The only way, sustainable way to approach this is to recognize that there are different identities, different communities, different ways of thinking about the world, different ways of thinking about solutions, and that these different ways of thinking should be recognized with mutual recognition and respect, and people should be allowed to live according to their own traditions and their own cultures. And in as far as there's an attempt to prescribe to people how they should think, to be culturally or ideologically imperialist in that sense, or to be paternalistic, that doesn't work. So justice, trying to achieve justice by punishing people will never work. It has never worked and it would never work. The only sustainable way is to say, recognize our communities, recognize our identities, recognize that there are differences, and allow people to find their place in this community and to contribute to something that is good. That's the only sustainable answer, we believe, to the question, how do we achieve justice?
And ladies and gentlemen, this is the end of the first part of the lecture, so don't go away because you've asked questions and we definitely want to find answers to that. And given the fact that we have raised the idea of injustice, one topic that obviously comes into mind is how did the share of land ownership between the black and the white communities change since the fall of the apartheid, and what inequalities are there now?
Yes, so South Africa is still a very unequal system, and there was something that happened in South Africa that was very interesting. We have very aggressive race legislation. South Africa currently I'm convinced that it is, the country in the history of the world with the most race laws. There are, according to a new study, more than 125 race laws in South Africa. In other words, pieces of legislation or policies that dictate that people should be classified or categorized according to the color of their skin, and then they should be treated differently. So there should be different sets of rules for different people depending on the color of your skin. That's very much the reality still in South Africa. And it's lumped under this term called black economic empowerment, which isn't really empowerment. It's more government dependency than it is empowerment. But something very interesting happened. These laws were implemented much more aggressively. They started implementing these laws around 1996. And then something interesting happened. And in other words, to put it differently, that these anti-white discriminatory laws, to put it bluntly, was implemented in the late 90s. But something happened. The more discrimination there were against white people, if we want to put it in racial terms, the wealthier they got in South Africa. So it is true that there is significant inequality in South Africa, and that the average white person in South Africa has much more material, from a material perspective than the average black South African. And there's an explanation for this. So we were discriminated against, and then we got wealthier. And there's an interesting explanation is many of us worked for the government at the time. Remember, there was this constitutional change, and so our community have actually become quite dependent on the government during the previous dispensation. And then there was a political change, and suddenly the government that was there to protect us and support us and provide jobs, almost overnight it turned against us, and it started discriminating against us. And so we were forced to leave the government sphere or the public sphere and to start our own businesses. So that's really the story of the Afrikaners, or part of the story of the Afrikaners, or part of the story of the Afrikaners after 1994 is leaving the public sphere and entering the private sphere and becoming entrepreneurs. And as a result, we are materially, even though we're not free, politically we're not free. Economically we are better off. And so the accusation is, oh, well, look at all this wealth. So now we need to be more aggressive with discriminatory policies, which is why we are now at this point where government is trying to change the constitution to just take people's stuff without paying for it.
Something less serious, but a final question. How does Afrikaner literary work help the AfriForums, or AfriForums help its objective? Is culture like
our own literature?
Yeah.
Oh, well, yeah, thank you.
Or do you produce cultural products?
Yes. So we are very proud of a whole bunch of achievements. One of our great achievements is the Afrikaans language, which is one of the most modern, newest languages, and it grew because it's not Dutch. Afrikaans is not the same as Dutch. There are some similarities, but if I find a Dutch person, if we talk slowly and if you are attuned, you might understand, but it's a distinct, unique language. And it developed very quickly into a scientific language where I did my doctorate now in Afrikaans, in my own language, which you couldn't do 100 years ago. And our literature has really been a fundamental part of who we are and our identity. We have one of our great philosophers or thinkers, N.P. van Wyk Louw, had this saying. He said that our task is to take, it's a typical Western thing to say, but the way he framed it was that a treasure was handed to us by our ancestors, and our generation's task is to carry this treasure through the crowd. And it links to the Burkean statement that about the covenant between those who are alive, those who have already died, and those who have not yet been born, and we are all in an agreement with each other. So literature, we have really we have a vast richness of poetry, of prose, of literature, of books, philosophy, and so forth, of which we are very, very proud.
And as a final question, I still want to stick to culture in some shape or form, because what MCC is doing, and it's truly a fascinating thing, is that I must brag with this, because last week we had a conference, it was the Neighborhood Dialogues Conference, and we had a folk dance event. And basically in the last 1.5 years, MCC has been quite consistent with this. The people who may not have been interested in folklore or not that interested in it still went here, we drank a bit, we danced a bit, we had fun. In South Africa, are there such cultural events or such culture festivals that can unite a Xhosa, an Afrikaner, a Zulu, or can there be a cultural event which would be somewhat of a unison sign between the different ethnicities?
Yes. I want to say yes and no. So we have a bit of a joke among each other. There's a day in South Africa called Heritage Day. It's the 24th of September. It's a public holiday, and the purpose of that day is to commemorate our joint heritage, to commemorate and to celebrate the things that we all have in common. And that day is also called Braaidag, which means barbecue day. So it's a day in which we all, we barbecue meat on an open fire. And so the joke is that the only thing we could found that we all have in common is we all eat meat that's not raw. So the problem in South Africa is it's difficult there are not really days or successful projects, at least. There are projects, but there are not really successful projects that have been developed with the aim of bringing different cultural communities together to celebrate their own cultures. And the reason why these projects aren't successful is the underlying ideology is always that you have to abandon your culture and you have to adopt and accept this new identity. This, for the nation to prosper, the tribe must die. And of course, when you do that, certain cultures are regarded as politically incorrect. So on this Heritage Day, if you go to an event and you celebrate Afrikaner culture, it's regarded as politically incorrect. You should celebrate another culture. And the underlying theme is always we must unite in our diversity. But when they say we must unite in our diversity, what that actually means in reality is we must unite by destroying our diversity. And that's why these projects don't work. But we would be, in as far as they do work, maybe to correct myself, in as far as there are such projects, it would be the examples I mentioned earlier of communities working together on things that they agree on, like I mentioned agricultural projects and so forth. And I can name some examples. We were invited, representatives from our organization were invited to the crowning of the new Zulu king. Now, we're not monarchs, we don't have a king, we are Republicans. And the monarchical system is alien to us, but it was an incredibly enriching cultural experience for my colleagues, at least, who attended this, to go to this ceremony and to support this cultural event. So if we want to bring cultures together and the approach is to try to blend them together, our experience is that doesn't work. If the approach is to show our culture to each other and to allow others the opportunity to witness and experience it, then that seems to work. And in as far as it does work in South Africa, it's informal, it's spontaneous, it's not government-driven, or it's not pre-planned projects, to put it that way.
And as I see from the crowd, there's a person wishing to ask questions. Go ahead.
Thanks a lot for this opportunity. Dear Mr. Roest, I'm a Europe correspondent, born in the Netherlands, so I should be able to talk a little Afrikaner.
Yeah.
But it's limited to stupid cliches like ijsbakkie.
Ijsbakkie, yes.
The word for elevator.
Yes.
Anyway, on a serious note, I was, of course, heading to this meeting wondering in the metro, why the hell is this South African man have an audience here in Hungary? So what is the synchronity or synchronicity, the parallels? Well, and that became clear. In the past, Agar, Blood River, you mentioned that. And then you mentioned the tribe must die, kill the Boers, the title of your book. Yes. You also mentioned the Hungarians must die. We come back to that in 1 second. But against this background, I wanted to ask you just a simple question. The background is, you remember Trump's tweet about your book. He was very worried about the large scale of killing white farmers, of scissoring their farms. Then even the White Farmers Union, I think the name was Agri-SA, they said, no, this is nonsense. They said this is false information. Then you mentioned the large killings. In fact, during your writing of your book, the killings were in total, 2018 in South Africa, 19,000. Of that, 0.3% were killings on farms, white farms, black farms. So against this background, I was wondering, what is exactly your message here? What is the synchrony with Hungarian farmers, with Dutch farmers, European farmers? And is your mentioning that the synchrony between kill the Boeren, the Hungarians must die, is that because you think that is the European ideology that is failing?
Wow, thank you. Okay, so let me say something about the farm murders and the book and maybe Donald Trump's comments on that, and then to get to the question about why are we here, and also just to link that to the comment about the Hungarians must die and how do we deal with Europe. So yes, that's actually, it links a bit to the second part of your question. That's actually one of the main reasons why we are here. You mentioned that I'm going to speak at CPAC next week, but also I'm very, very honored to be here and to announce actually that my book has been translated into Hungarian, and we're going to launch the book next week on the 2nd of May. So I wrote a book about the farm killings in South Africa. I grew up on a farm in South Africa, and I mean, if we want to talk about dark subjects, the reality about the violence on the farms in South Africa is so serious that I can give you a list of the people I knew who were murdered on farms. One was, this is a person I didn't know. It was actually my father's cousin. My father's cousin was an elderly lady. She was attacked on a farm. She was, the way she was murdered was they stoned her, and then they eventually pierced a garden fork through her head. That's how she was murdered. And my brother was attacked on a farm. He survived. I had a friend from school who was killed during one of these attacks. I can give you many such examples. So this book is about the scourge of farm killings, and it was translated to Hungarian now, of which I'm very glad. And Donald Trump picked up on this topic. I'm very honored to have been interviewed by Tucker Carlson on Fox News in 2018. And he made several sections about the violence on the farms, and then Donald Trump commented on this as well, which of course led to severe criticism to us, because, you know, if Donald Trump says it's a problem, then it must certainly not be a problem. So I'm very grateful about the book being translated. That's part of the reason why we are here. We are also here to make a documentary film about Hungary and Hungarian identity and culture, to expose our audience back at home to Hungary and the challenges that the Hungarians are faced with. And then also we've done a study. It's not finished yet. We're still working on it, and it might be a great thing for MCC, about the historic overlaps and similarities between the Boers or the Afrikaners and the Hungarians. And there are some fascinating stories about Kossuth Lajos, for example, and Paul Kruger. Kossuth Lajos, this freedom leader for the Hungarians, and Paul Kruger, the leader of the Boer during the Boer War, and the similarities between these two, which I'm not going to go into now. And so the question is if we say for the nation to prosper, the tribe must die, it's a bit like saying for Europe to prosper, the Hungarians must die. And to point that out is not to say that Europe shouldn't exist or there mustn't be cooperation. The point is to say that there must be cooperation, and I'm speaking as an outsider, so I might be wrong, but as an outsider, I would say, or we would say, that there must be cooperation within Europe. European countries have some things in common that they don't have in common with other continents and other countries. But that cooperation must be based on the idea that there are differences between these nations, and these differences must be accepted, and they have different ways of thinking, and that should be acknowledged and respected.
And I think that would be a nice closing sentence for our lecture today. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming here. I hope you learned a lot. And I just try to keep saying sentences before you clap. That is like the tension part where the drums are rolling. But please give a warm round of applause for our guest today. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.